Hi, everyone. So my name is Hannah, and I am so excited to be here today. Thank you for that wonderful introduction and to all of you for attending. Getting to create the story of Anne Boleyn has truly been one of the most incredible experiences I have had at Yale, and I'm so grateful for everyone who made the project possible. So I wanted to start out by just explaining the exhibit a little bit more, as well as the who and why of Anne Boleyn, the extraordinary woman who is pictured on the screen today. And after that, I'm going to walk you all through the exhibit and tell you about every single piece that is on display. But before we dive into why Anne, a little context about the project as a whole. So I spent the last year as one of Yale's student curators. And essentially what that means is I took an academic project I cared deeply about, and I went on a treasure hunt through the university archives. Many of the items in this exhibit are from the Beinecke, but others are from diverse Yale Library collections and outposts. I got to spend hours taking direct materials and manuscripts from the 1500s and all of the centuries since, and holding them in my own hands, which absolutely blew my mind. And of course, I also spent many hours trying to interpret the handwriting on said ancient manuscripts. So this talk is going to be a digital exploration of the exhibit I curated, which, as Michael mentioned, anyone can find on display in Sterling Memorial Library. I was able to learn so much, not just about the figure of Anne, but also about the archival and curational processes. So finally, why Anne? Now, Anne Boleyn is an infamous historical figure. Some of you may know a lot about her, and some of you may never have heard of her. As we talk about her, I'm also going to display the first case in the exhibit, which displays portraits of Anne, and which we'll talk through one by one in just a few minutes. But first, just a brief summary. Anne was the second wife of King Henry VIII of England, who himself was best known for his 6 marriages and his split to create the Church of England and appoint himself head. Anne herself is best known as the second wife whom he executed and whom he split from the Catholic Church from in order to marry, although of course the full story is far, far more complicated. Now, Anne herself has been remembered by history as an adulteress, a witch, a villain, but also as an influential politician, a martyr. And in the words of one of my favorite of her biographers, Eric Ives, Anne deserves to be a feminist icon. Her strong voice captured my attention from the moment I first encountered her back in middle school, and I'm so excited to share with you what I think is simply a phenomenal story, legacy, and woman. So I wanted to start with some portraits of Anne and talk about what she looked like. Now, this sounds like a simple task, but it actually might be the most historically controversial part of the entire exhibit. I'll note that I've also included every single artifact that is in the physical display in Sterling in these slides, and I've also organized them in the same groupings as they are in the physical cases. So along the way, we'll also be able to talk about the process of breaking down the story and putting it into a concrete narrative. Now, as you can see, looking at these 4 images on the screen, Anne's depiction, even her face, looks quite different in each one. So there are some similarities, particularly between the 2 on the left and the 2 on the right, and their fashion styles, but it's really hard to narrow down her exact appearance. Now, the reason for this is twofold. First, after Anne was executed, Henry had many of the traces of her own existence destroyed, which is one reason that we don't actually have any confirmed portrait of her from her own lifetime. So the portrait in color on the left is from the late 16th century, but the rest are all actually 18th century prints, based off of, quote, ancient originals, as you can see on the caption of the one to the far left. Now, the second issue with creating an actual description of what Anne looked like is that the written evidence is just completely contradictory and full of biases. So some contemporaries described her as being beautiful. Others claim that she had, 6 figures, projecting teeth, and was covered in warts. Now, nothing's impossible, but we can pretty safely assume that the latter description is untrue, and the only thing that seems pretty much confirmed is that she had dark hair. Now, the controversy itself is actually evidenced in the small portrait to the far right on the screen, which is from the Lewis Walpole Library, which is a Yale library in Farmington. And you can see on the very bottom, it's kind of in faded print, but there's the name Anne Boleyn. But then underneath it, you have the inscribed name Jane Seymour. Now, Jane Seymour was the name of Henry's third wife. So what you see right there is a misattribution, that people thought the portrait was Jane and then later corrected it to be Anne. And this small kind of debacle in itself evidences the whole debate that you see across these varied images of her. And now, while I was at the Lewis Walpole Library, I actually got to sort through all these files and prints of Anne that were yet to be labeled, and essentially play this role of historical detective when it came to their origins and their context. And you see a lot of this kind of historical debate in all of these different details. So another detail I wanted to point out is the bee necklace in the image second from left. Now, this kind of pearled bee has become a motif associated with Anne, and you see it throughout all of these modern media depictions, which we'll talk about later on. But it doesn't appear in the other images, even though you can see they all have different iterations of kind of pearls and detailing. Further, in the two photos that are on the left, Anne is wearing a French hood, but on the right, she's wearing a gable hood, which is more of an English style. So Anne actually spent a lot of time during her adolescence at the French court, and it was there where she kind of caught the English court's eye upon return for bringing in this French charm and sense of culture. But as queen, it seems like she really tried to emphasize her English authority and roots. So even in this small stylistic choice alone, you see its own diplomatic statement. Now, these are a few of the details in the portraits. One of my favorite parts about the exhibit as a whole is that there's a puzzle in every single item. So the next segment of the case described the things that would have surrounded Anne in her personal life. So we have objects that were quite literally in her own home, as well as a few iterations of family trees, one being the Bolins themselves, and the other being the wives of Henry. Now, through these small details, historians are able to reconstruct a more realistic picture of Anne's life and her day-to-day. So on the left, there's a sketch of Anne's family crest. You have an image of her bedroom window, and you also have a sketch of a clock given to her by Henry on their wedding night. And these are more intimate images that would have surrounded her life. The sketches themselves are actually all 19th century images, but of course they are of 16th century objects. Now, the intertwined H and A, which you can see by the clock, was actually the symbol of Anne and Henry, and their motto was "the most happy," which is, of course, ironic, as we will get to when we talk all about the arc of their romance and fall. Now, the original clock ended up at the collection of Horace Walpole of Yale's Lewis Walpole Library, which houses about half his volumes in total. Now, on the right, we have two iterations of a family tree, each of which has a different focus on Anne's life. The one from 1770 has images of the 6 wives of Henry VIII, including Anne, and of course, each of those women could deserve an entire exhibit in their own regard. But on the right, we have a handwritten Bolin family tree from the 1600s. And I wanted to give it an up-close feature because I think that these handwritten artifacts themselves are particularly phenomenal and full of character. Now, the Bolin family themselves was relatively well off, and of course their status rose as Anne became a favorite of the king. Anne's parents were Thomas and Elizabeth Bolin, and her siblings were George and Mary. Now, Mary Bolin was actually also a mistress of Henry VIII, and because of that is actually a direct ancestor of 21st century monarchs Elizabeth II and Charles III. Now, looking at the details on this map, which of course only covers a few generations, you can see that every person is labeled with their status title as well. Further, you had these big figures, including Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, who was Anne's daughter, who were just kind of thrown in as characters within the Bolin family tree. So they have equal weight on this image as, say, Anne's nieces and nephews, for example. So while you do see some trace of social hierarchy on the map, you also see that monarchy is viewed underneath the lens of family, which I find fascinating. Now, moving on from Anne's personal life, I wanted to talk about the world in which she lived in. Now, one of the most important legacies of Anne, the Tudors, and Henry is their relation to the English Reformation. Now, popular history goes that Henry was so infatuated with Anne, and of course the prospect of her ability to have a son, that he broke off from the Catholic Church in order to divorce his former wife, appointed himself head of the Church of England, and quite literally turned England Protestant and, changed the course of European history. Again, that's the simplified version that has kind of gone into this popular narrative of Anne, and it itself could be a subject of another talk. But what is quite interesting is that Anne certainly did have an interest in political and religious reform, although her exact influence has been debated by historians. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Anne spent a period at the French court, where she was likely exposed to reformist views, hints of which would shine through her reign through her patronage. Now, what I wanted to draw your attention to are these documents, which are some of my favorite parts of the entire exhibit, and tell us a lot about the broader world that Anne lived in. And as you'll see, it's one that was often dark and unstable. So on the far left, we actually have an 1804 print of Elizabeth Barton, who was also known as the Holy Maid of Kent. Now, Elizabeth Barton was a Catholic nun who had religious visions and actually met with both Henry VIII and Cardinal Wolsey. But then she started prophesizing about the English Reformation and against Henry's marriage to Anne, and she was then executed in 1534 at age 28. Now, I included this image not just because of its literal relation to Anne's story, but also because I thought there was something prophetic about these two women, executed 2 years apart at the very same court for acting against the same king. Now, on a much less dark note, in the middle, we have a Bouche of Court manuscript from the 16th century Tudor court itself. This is probably actually my one favorite item in the entire exhibit. And essentially a bouche of court, which in French translates to have mouth at court, records all the privileges of food and drink that were granted by the monarch. So it ends up being this fascinating quotidian record. When you look at the page that's displayed on this slide, it's actually a menu. So you can see first course, second course, and you can actually see the food items. So for example, one of the lines says butter and eggs. And honestly, a huge portion of the rest of the document, if we were to go through it, is all about portioning ale. So I think this is one of those really, really fascinating items because it's really humanizing. And it's objects like this that really allow us to relate to a world that is hundreds of years away, because while things might seem so different today, a lot of the elements of human life never really change at all. And now finally looking at the right side of the screen, we have a book that did not belong to Anne, but belonged to Thomas More, who was the author of Utopia and the Lord High Chancellor of England, and he's pictured in the portrait above the book. Now, More was staunchly against the English Reformation and was ultimately executed because he opposed Henry as head of the Church of England, and he also opposed the annulment of his marriage to Catherine, who was Anne's predecessor. So I wanted to zoom in on his Book of Hours right here, because it really deserves its own close-up. Now, what you can see is the first page of his handwritten final prayer, which he wrote in 1535, and it's legible in his own handwriting. Now, when I saw this book, which is held at the Beinecke, I was able to touch the physical page, touch the ink of an incredibly important historical figure, which again was one of those just otherworldly experiences that I couldn't believe I was able to do. And if we looked at his handwriting on this page, we see the first line, which says, "Give me thy grace, good Lord, to set the world at naught." Now, for those interested in the rest of the prayer, you can search up more Psalm on detachment, and it'll also be linked to the online website version of my exhibit, which I'm going to share at the end of the presentation. But even in that first line alone, I mean, it's phenomenal, and you can imagine that he's writing that knowing that he's about to be executed for his beliefs. Now, these three sections compose the first case of the exhibit, which took a more kind of hands-on approach to Anne through her image, through objects from her personal life, and through objects which represented this greater world in which she lived in. Now, the second exhibit is a bit more about mythology and the specific episodes of her life that have been taken up by historians and by contemporary audiences. So I wanted to start with the first slide from that exhibit, which is all about Anne's romance with Henry. Now, this is one of those chapters that has just left an unimaginable impression in public memory, and the objects in this case are showing that mythology and the history of their love affair. So Anne and Henry were actually introduced about a decade before their marriage itself, but he became interested in her in about 1526. And at the time, her sister Mary was already his mistress. Now, Anne was known for her charm and her cunning around court, which caught Henry's eye. Again, much of which is attributed to her time at the French court, where she was exposed to those political and religious ideas and actually had really incredible female role models as well. Now, Anne also had an earlier secret engagement to a man named Henry Percy, and she was also lady in waiting to Henry's wife at the time, his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Now, Anne and King Henry would be married in 1533, and their daughter, Elizabeth I, was born later that year. And while their marriage only lasted about 3 years in total, their relationship was thus about a decade. Now, what we have here are three cartoons on the left, which are from the 18th and 19th centuries, and they were done by the renowned William Hogarth as well as George Cruikshank, who are two really big figures in English print and art. And through these three images, you get to see all the trials and tribulations of Anne and Henry's relationship within the larger context of the theme of courtly romance. So in the image on the far left, Hogarth depicts the courtship of Anne and Henry, as seen under the spited gaze of their old beloveds. So you can see in the background Catherine of Aragon, and you can also see Henry Percy, respectively. But then in the two cartoons in the middle, done by George Cruikshank, you see these themes of infidelity and jealousy as they become internal to Henry and Anne's own relationship. So on the very top, Anne is spying Henry with Jane Seymour, who would then be his third wife, while below, Henry's jealous gaze turns on Anne and Henry Norris, who is one of the men who would later be executed alongside her. But by far the most striking part of the case to me are love letters between Henry VIII and Anne. Now, this is a particularly notable part of the display because just like every other student exhibit, my project actually began with a class paper. So for me, this came from a class on the origins of English Empire. And while Anne was not originally on the syllabus, as the professor very nicely explained to me on the first day, I decided to make her the focus of a final paper. And while I was writing the paper, I discovered that Yale had these rare prints of love letters between her and Henry, where you had the opportunity to really hear these mythic figures in their own voices. And essentially, the rest of this exhibit grew from those letters. It was really kind of one of those, again, academic eureka moments about the incredible resources and prints that are out there. And now, before I go to zoom in on one of the letters between Henry and Anne, I also wanted to note that the letter at the top right is actually from Anne to Cardinal Wolsey, and it was included in one of these kind of printed, generally romantic collections. Overall, less of Anne's writings, or even those attributed to her, survive. But what you see here is that she's discussing Cardinal Wolsey's intervention to help Henry get an annulment from Catherine. Anne is actually using this kind of gendered rhetoric, so she's relying on flattery and almost using a self-deprecating tone to get what she wants, which is really interesting. I wanted to read one line from it at the very top, which says, quote, "My lord, and my most humblest wise that my heart can think, I desire you to pardon me, that I am so bold to trouble you with my simple and rude writing." Now, this is incredibly ironic because even reading this one letter, you see her incredible ability to strategize. And you see the sense of intellect and cunning that is clear throughout her entire existence and life. But then moving on from that, I wanted to zoom into a letter from Henry to Anne, which really acts as a portal into their relationship. So in this letter, he writes, "I wish the time may be short, but I shall think it long, till we shall see one another." Now, the tragic end to their romance aside, this is the sort of sentiment that essentially means, "I can't wait to see you," that we would say today. He then signs the letter saying, "Written by the hand of the secretary, who in heart, body, and will is your most loyal and most assured servant." And then he signs off using code. So see, he says H, no other, AB, which are Anne's initials, seeks Rex. And of course, Rex means king in Latin. So really, really phenomenal. Now, moving on to the next case, we move on from the romance to see all of these images of her demise and her execution, which was this personal experience that garnered national and historical attention. Now, Anne was executed because she was accused of being an adulteress and even a witch. And 5 men were beheaded besides her for being her lovers, and this literally included her own brother George. Now, notably, there is essentially no historical evidence that Anne had any affairs whatsoever. And instead, scholars have theorized that once again, there was this combination of her inability to have a son, and she actually had stillborn births in 1534 and 36, combined with outside political events, combined with encouragement from other court players, as she was an unpopular figure to many, all which kind of led to this tumultuous storm and eventually conspiracy against her. Now, Anne was beheaded in 1536, and just about a week later, Henry married his third wife, Jane Seymour. So, looking at this display, we have sketches and writing that kind of imagines her execution and the emotions that she might have been feeling. So, the print on the far left is the condemnation of Anne Boleyn. And I'm really fascinated by this light that appears to be shining on her from an outside source, and it's not on any of the kind of men judges around her. And she's the moment she really realizes her fate and be this light from a higher power of Henry or God. And then next, we see an image on the bottom in the middle of her execution. And this is actually an image where the caption below is in Dutch, which I think is fascinating. And then we see on the top middle and then on the right a letter and a poem that are both imagined to be from Anne to Henry, where she is pleading to him and discussing her own end. So the copy of the letter is from, or the one we see on the screen is from 1630. Although it was basically at first assumed to have been from Anne. There was a copy that was supposedly found in Thomas Cromwell's papers, so it's likely originally from the 1530s, although many scholars then decided that it probably wasn't actually written by Anne herself, because the tone didn't quite seem like someone who really knew that she was fully about to be executed. And then the poem, which is on the right, is from 1755, and it's imagined to be from Anne to Henry, but of course it's known to be a work of fiction. But both of them are really interesting in their contents, and they also kind of involve this idea of her being wife and queen. So the poem has a more playful tone. Again, it's kind of an imagined piece, and in the very first verse, it reads, "With mingled rays your sovereign head adorn, permit unhappy Anne at left to mourn. Permit one object to disturb the scene, an injured lover and a captive queen." Then we have the letter, which again is debatable in its exact authenticity, but it starts with this line that says, "Your grace's displeasure and mine imprisonment are things so strange." And that opening line really says something real or imagined, because while we look to Anne and Henry as almost these mythological characters or fantastical ones, they were real people. And I think that's why the tragedy of her execution at his hands and their love story as a whole never really kind of fails to compel and to fascinate us. Now, the next section of case number 2 focuses on the idea of legacy. And the first kind of half of imagining Anne's legacy is direct and literal, and it's her daughter, Elizabeth I, as well as her position within the Tudor dynasty. So we see on the far left this mini family tree that has Henry, Anne, and Elizabeth. In the far corner on the right, we see this later portrait of Elizabeth. And I think that there's something overall that's just incredibly poetic about the fact that Anne was villainized and executed for her sexuality, for her ambition. But her daughter became one of the first queens in England and arguably one of the most renowned monarchs ever. In fact, I actually wanted to quote a line from a film depiction that's going to be in the next and final case. And the film is titled Anne of a Thousand Days. And while it's a fictional line, I think it sums up my interpretation of Anne's legacy through Elizabeth. So I just wanted to read it. And for context, it is in the scene where Henry visits Anne in the tower right before her execution. So Anne says in the scene, "Elizabeth shall be a greater queen than any king of yours. She shall rule a greater England than you ever could have built. Yes, my Elizabeth shall be queen, and my blood will have been well spent." And while it's imagined, I think the incredible thing is the truth in this line. Elizabeth I would rule for longer than Henry in this golden age of English history, the age of the English Renaissance, of William Shakespeare. And then the Tudor dynasty itself is one that has been this just giant subject of fascination and legacy. So we have a portrait on the bottom middle from the Yale Center for British Art, which is called An Allegory of the Tudor Succession, the Family of Henry VIII. And in it, Anne is nowhere to be found. So she herself was often excluded from direct Tudor memory and history, and you see that in this painting. But of course, both she and Elizabeth really shaped the course of English history, and that became apparent through Elizabeth's reign. And I think the lack of kind of direct artifacts from Anne is really shocking. And something that you might have noticed on one of the earlier objects, but we didn't talk about, is that there's even scholarly disagreement on the date that Anne was born. So some scholars think she was born in 1501, and some that she was born in 1507, and the answer would really radically change our understanding of her and her life. Now, in the object on the top right, you see this incredibly detailed family tree, and some of this kind of historical confusion is present. So there are all of these little notes where the author, who was a scholar from the very end of the 18th century, mentions some facts as being unclear. He says, I think some other scholars err, and then the whole bottom quadrant has all of his notes and reflections on this historiography. And I think it's fascinating, and I also just wanted to show the depth of character that you really only get from a handmade piece like some of these incredible pieces in the exhibit. Now, the final part of the final case, so the end of my exhibit, is all about legacy and memory through media. So when I thought about how I wanted to kind of end this display, I went back to my own origins of Anne. So I discovered her story about a decade ago through historical fiction. And personally, I'm a believer that, looking at historical fiction, looking at depictions in media are really essential, both because they leave this record of cultural understanding of events, but they're also really this method to introduce larger audiences and the general public to figures, eras, and events. So I wanted to give a nod to a few depictions of her that over the past century have become and inspired new audiences to become interested in her. Although I'll also note there are dozens, if not hundreds of items, and these are just 4 films, a small selection. And in fact, in the physical exhibit, you can actually stop and scan QR codes to watch clips from each of these 4 pieces. And it's the first time that video and multimedia were embedded into one of these exhibits. So very grateful to everyone who made that possible. So on the far left, we have a black and white German silent film from 1920 called Anne Boleyn, directed by Ernst Lubitsch. Then we have on the top right, an opera rendition of Anna Bolena, composed by Gaetano Donizetti from a performance at the Metropolitan Opera. In the very middle, we have Anne of a Thousand Days, the film I mentioned and quoted from earlier, which was nominated for 10 Oscars in 1969 and stars Richard Burton, Genevieve Bujold, and Irene Papas. And then and in the far corner, we have a still from The Other Bolin Girl, which is from 2008 and was based on a novel by Philippa Gregory and stars Natalie Portman, Scarlett Johansson, and Eric Bana, and that's just a really fun piece. And for this holiday week, I definitely recommend, if anyone has any spare time, to check out any of these films. They're all incredible. And each of them really focuses on different parts of Anne's story, her character, but the consistency is that in each and every one, she's an extraordinary woman. She's always bold and she's always brave. I ended the exhibit here because I thought it was the perfect way to connect Anne's story from the 1500s until today, because there's something about her that just keeps capturing the attention of audiences. In fact, in the past year alone, there was a new exhibit of the Tudors at the Met, and just 3 days after my own exhibit opened in Sterling, there was a review of a new Anne Boleyn biography in the New York Times. So this is really a continuous subject of historical fascination. And my exhibit has been able to take on its own life, including a screening series with the Yale Film Archive and an online version of the exhibit. So I put the link right here. So if you want to go back and take a closer look of any of these objects, you're able to do so at this online site. Ultimately, Anne has a place in my heart, but so does the Tudor era as a whole. And I think that one of the reasons I'm so interested in early modern history is because it's old enough that in many ways it feels like this mystery to piece together, as you probably saw through some of the steps I described. But it's also close enough that you see all these semblances of our world today. Now, Anne herself is a defiant figure. She inverted expectations of womanhood, and she found her place in so many ways that we don't even have time to talk about today. So I'm so excited to get to share these pieces of her story. And thank you all so much again for being here. I can't express how much it means to me. And if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to now answer them.